Racist cop punches black pregnant woman. He is shocked when finds out who her father is. Alana's heart raced as the flashing blue and red lights painted streaks of urgency across her rearview mirror. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, and she forced herself to take deep breaths. She had done nothing wrong, of that she was sure. But as a visibly pregnant black woman, alone on a secluded stretch of road, the fear of what might happen next weighed heavily on her. She slowed her car and pulled to the side of the road, her movements deliberate, her hands trembling slightly. Instinctively, she placed a protective hand on her belly, cradling the life growing inside her. 5 months pregnant, Alana had been on her way home after her doctor's appointment. She was tired, the kind of tired only an expectant mother would understand, and her only thought had been getting home to rest. The officer's car came to a halt behind her. The flashing lights reflected off her rearview mirror, casting ghostly shadows across her face. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 4 p.m., but the overcast sky gave the illusion of dusk. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Always keep your hands visible. Be polite, even when they're not. Stay calm. He had taught her and her brother these lessons from a young age, lessons born of painful necessity. License and registration. The officer barked as he approached her window. His tone was devoid of courtesy, carrying an edge that sent a shiver down Alana's spine. He was tall, with a square jaw set tight and eyes that seemed to pierce through her. She lowered the window just enough to hand over her documents, her hands trembling as she did so. Was I speeding? Alana asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety tightening her chest. The officer didn't answer. He barely glanced at her license before his eyes locked on her. His gaze was cold and calculating, scanning her as if searching for an excuse to escalate the situation. Step out of the car, he ordered. Alana's heart skipped a beat. Step out? Why? She hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. She wanted to question him, to plead her case, but the sharpness in his tone warned her against resistance. Officer, is there a reason? She asked cautiously, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. I'm pregnant. I just came from a doctor's appointment. I said step out of the car, he repeated, louder this time. His hand moving toward the baton on his belt. Alana's breath hitched. This was no ordinary traffic stop. She had seen the stories, heard the names, and now she was living it. With every fiber of her being, she fought the urge to panic. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The officer stepped back, watching her intently as she exited the vehicle. Her legs felt shaky beneath her as she stood. She kept her hands visible, resting them on her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the hostility radiating off the man before her. What's the problem, officer? She asked, her voice trembling but firm. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for her to move to the front of her car. She obeyed, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the nearby forest. You think you can just do whatever you want, the officer sneered. His voice was low and menacing as he loomed over her. People like you think the rules don't apply. People like you. The words cut through her like a blade, the weight of their implication pressing down on her chest. Alana's mind screamed for her to stay calm, to say nothing, to not give him a reason. I've done nothing wrong, she said softly, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. The officer's eyes narrowed. You're going to tell me what you're hiding, he growled, stepping closer. Get on the ground. Alana froze. Her knees buckled slightly, and she instinctively clutched her stomach. I can't, she stammered. I'm pregnant, please. The officer's patience snapped. I said get on the ground, he shouted, his hand gripping his baton tightly. Before Alana could respond, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, her knees giving out as she clutched her belly. Panic surged through her. Something was wrong. Help, she whispered. But the officer didn't move. His expression remained cold, indifferent. Alana's trembling hands reached for her phone. She fumbled to dial, her vision blurring as the pain intensified. The line rang, and a deep, steady voice answered. Alana? What's wrong? Dad, she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I need help. He's. On the other end of the line, Chief David's voice dropped, a calm before the storm. Stay calm, Alana. Where are you? As she choked out her location, the officer reached down, snatching the phone from her grasp. What do you think you're doing? He spat, tossing the phone to the ground. The line went dead. Alana's vision blurred further, her body trembling as the sound of distant sirens grew louder. Unbeknownst to the officer, he had just made a fatal mistake. Moments later, a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt. The doors flew open, and an imposing figure stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. Chief David, head of the city's police department and Alana's father, strode toward them, his expression cold as steel. What is going on here? He demanded, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. The officer turned, his bravado faltering as recognition dawned. Chief. He stammered, but the words wouldn't come. Chief David's eyes narrowed as he knelt beside his daughter, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. Are you hurt? He asked softly, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Alana nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. He hurt me, she whispered. Chief David stood, towering over the officer whose confidence had all but vanished. Explain yourself, he commanded, his voice cold as ice. The officer stammered, his words incoherent as he tried to justify his actions. But Chief David's gaze bore into him, silencing any weak excuses. You have no idea who you just laid hands on, Chief David said, his voice low but deadly. And believe me, you will answer for this. Alana had always been careful, a necessity for a black woman navigating the world. At 29 years old, she had carved out a stable life for herself. A dedicated nurse, she worked long hours helping others and dreamed of a peaceful life for her unborn child. Her pregnancy had been unexpected but welcomed with open arms. Although the child's father was no longer in the picture, Alana's strong support network of family and friends gave her the confidence to embrace motherhood wholeheartedly. Her father, Chief David, was a towering figure both in her life and in the city, the head of the local police department and a man known for his integrity. He had raised Alana and her brother with clear values: kindness, strength, and the importance of standing up for what was right. But he had also imparted a more somber lesson, one rooted in harsh reality. The world will see your skin before it sees you, he had told her. Be smart, be careful, and always stay calm. Alana carried those words with her everywhere, a shield against a world that often judged her before she had the chance to speak. But today, on this quiet stretch of road, they felt like a fragile barrier. She had just finished a routine doctor's appointment and decided to take the scenic route home to avoid traffic. The road was peaceful, lined with trees shedding their golden leaves in the crisp autumn air. It should have been a tranquil drive, a moment of reflection before returning to the bustle of life. When she first saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, her initial reaction was confusion. She hadn't been speeding, and her car was in perfect condition. Maybe it's a mistake, she thought, pulling over to the side of the road. But as the officer approached, her confusion turned to unease. The rigid set of his shoulders, the cold expression on his face, the way his hand hovered near his belt, it all set her nerves on edge. Alana's training as a nurse had taught her to recognize danger quickly, and her instincts screamed that something was wrong. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel as the officer reached her window. License and registration, he demanded, his tone clipped and impatient. She complied, moving slowly and deliberately, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him the documents. Was I speeding? She asked, her voice calm despite the rising fear in her chest. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at her license briefly before his eyes locked onto hers, sharp and assessing. Step out of the car, he ordered. The words hit her like a physical blow. Step out? Why? She had done nothing wrong. Alana's heart raced as she considered her options. She thought of the countless stories she had heard, the names and faces that had become hashtags and headlines. She thought of her father's warnings and the quiet fear in his eyes every time she left the house. I'm pregnant, she said softly, placing a protective hand on her belly. Please, Can you tell me why you need me to step out of the car? The officer's expression hardened. Step out of the car, he repeated, louder this time, his hand now resting on the baton at his belt. Alana's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about power. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, her mind racing. Stay calm, she reminded herself. Don't give him a reason. But deep down, she knew that her compliance might not matter. To him, she was already guilty of something. She just didn't know what. Stepping out of the car, Alana felt the cold autumn air bite at her skin. She stood with her hands visible, resting them on her belly as if to shield the life growing inside her. The officer's eyes flicked to her stomach, then back to her face. There was no empathy there, no recognition of her humanity, only cold authority. Move to the front of the car, he commanded. Alana obeyed, her legs trembling as she walked. She could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his judgment pressing down like a physical force. Her mind raced with thoughts of her father. She wanted to call him, to hear his steady voice and feel the safety it brought. But the officer's presence loomed over her, making every action feel like a risk. She prayed silently for the strength to endure whatever came next. As she reached the front of the car, the officer stepped closer, his hand still resting on his baton. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Alana's heart pounded. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm just trying to get home." But the officer wasn't listening. To him, she wasn't a nurse, a daughter, or a soon-to-be mother. She was a suspect, a target, a challenge to his authority. And no amount of compliance would change that. Alana stood at the front of her car, her body trembling as the officer loomed closer. The air felt heavy, thick with tension and unspoken threats. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, each beat echoing in her ears. Her protective hand rested on her belly, as if shielding her unborn child from the hostility radiating off the man before her. "What are you hiding?" the officer demanded again, his tone dripping with suspicion. His gaze bore into her, searching for something to justify his escalating aggression. "I'm not hiding anything," Alana said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Please, I just want to go home." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his hand tightening on the baton at his belt. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "You people think you can get away with anything?" Alana's breath hitched. "You people." The words hung in the air like a poison, their meaning unmistakable. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to cry. Showing weakness would only make things worse. "Officer," she began cautiously, "I'm 5 months pregnant. I'm not a threat. Please, let me go home. Pregnant or not, you're going to do as I say," he snapped, his voice rising. "Now get on the ground." Alana froze. "On the ground?" she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. She glanced down at her swollen belly, then back at him. "I can't. I'm pregnant. Please, that could hurt my baby." The officer's patience evaporated. "I said get on the ground," he shouted, pulling his baton from his belt. The threat was clear, and Alana's fear spiked. Tears welled in her eyes as she slowly lowered herself to her knees, her body trembling with every movement. The cold pavement bit into her skin, and she wrapped her arms protectively around her belly. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not resisting." The officer stepped closer, towering over her like a predator over its prey. "You think you can play the victim," he sneered, "but I know your type." Alana's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out of this nightmare. She thought of her father, of the lessons he had taught her. Stay calm, stay polite. Call for help if you can. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Alana reached for her phone. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the device as she tried to unlock it. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he snatched the phone from her grasp. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, tossing the phone to the ground. It skidded across the pavement, the screen shattering on impact. Alana let out a choked sob, the last thread of her composure unraveling. The officer's actions weren't just about power. They were about humiliation, about stripping her of any semblance of control. In the distance, the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Alana glanced up, her tear-streaked face catching a glimmer of hope. A small group of bystanders had begun to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Some held their phones up, recording the scene unfolding before them. "She's pregnant," someone shouted from the crowd. "Leave her alone." The officer's jaw tightened, and he turned toward the onlookers. "Stay back," he barked. "This is police business." But the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, their voices grew louder, their outrage palpable. "She didn't do anything," another voice called. "You're out of line." The officer's face twisted in anger. He turned back to Alana, his hand gripping his baton so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Get up," he ordered, his voice low and menacing. "We're done playing games." Alana struggled to rise, her body shaking from the effort. The pain in her abdomen was sharp and unrelenting, a warning sign she couldn't ignore. "I need help," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please, my baby." The officer didn't respond. His focus was on maintaining control, on asserting his authority over her and the growing crowd. But the crowd was no longer silent. Their anger had turned to action as they called 911, demanding immediate assistance. Phones captured every moment, documenting the officer's aggression and Alana's distress. Unbeknownst to the officer, one of those calls had reached the ears of someone who mattered, Chief David. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the chaos, their wail growing louder with each passing second. Alana's heart lifted slightly, hope flickering to life. Help was coming. The officer glanced over his shoulder, his posture stiffening as two additional squad cars pulled up. Uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes widening as they took in the scene before them. A visibly pregnant woman on the ground, a furious crowd, and an officer whose aggression was on full display. Among the new arrivals was a tall, commanding figure in a crisp suit. Chief David stepped out of an unmarked black SUV, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. His gaze immediately locked onto Alana, and his heart clenched at the sight of his daughter in such a vulnerable state. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The officer turned, his face paling as he recognized the man approaching. "The chief. I didn't know," he stammered, his bravado crumbling. Chief David ignored him, his focus solely on Alana. He knelt beside her, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with barely restrained anger. Alana nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, he hurt me," she whispered, her voice breaking. David's jaw tightened, and he stood slowly, turning to face the officer. The temperature seemed to drop as his cold, steely gaze bore into the man. "Explain yourself," he commanded, his voice low and deadly. The officer stammered, his words tumbling out in a jumbled mess of excuses. But David wasn't listening. His attention shifted to the other officers who had arrived. "Get paramedics over here now," he ordered, "and make sure this man is placed on administrative leave immediately." The officers scrambled to comply, the weight of the chief's authority leaving no room for argument. Paramedics rushed to Alana's side, carefully helping her onto a stretcher as David stayed close, his presence a shield against any further harm. The officer, now stripped of his confidence, stood frozen as David turned back to him. "You have no idea who you just laid hands on," David said, his voice cold and measured. "And believe me, you will answer for this." As the officer was led away, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. Justice, at least for now, had been served. But for Alana, the scars of the encounter would remain, a stark reminder of the world she was bringing her child into. Chief David stood by her side as the paramedics prepared to transport her to the hospital. His hand rested protectively on her shoulder, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I'll make sure of it." Alana nodded, her tears flowing freely. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her emotions. She was safe, her baby was safe, and the man who had tried to strip her of her dignity would face the consequences. But even as she found solace in her father's presence, she knew the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle in a much larger war. The air around the scene grew still, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The flashing lights of the police cars continued to cast a rhythmic glow on the pavement, but the crowd's earlier outrage had shifted to an uneasy silence. All eyes were on Chief David, who stood like an immovable force beside his daughter, Alana. His steely gaze was fixed on the officer who had dared to harm her. Alana lay on the stretcher, her breath coming in shallow gasps as paramedics worked carefully to assess her condition. Despite the care she was receiving, she couldn't shake the fear and humiliation of what had just happened. Her hand never left her belly, her protective instincts for her unborn child overriding everything else. "We're taking her to the hospital now," one of the paramedics said to Chief David, who nodded without taking his eyes off the officer. He leaned down, placing a reassuring hand on Alana's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice filled with both comfort and a promise. "I'll meet you there soon." Alana managed a weak nod, her tears spilling silently down her cheeks as the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. The crowd watched as the vehicle pulled away, its sirens wailing into the distance. For a moment, the only sound that remained was the low murmur of voices among the onlookers. Chief David straightened, his commanding presence drawing all attention back to him. He turned to the officer, who was now flanked by two of his colleagues, his confidence utterly shattered. "What's your name?" David asked, his tone sharp and devoid of patience. "Harding, sir," the officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. David stepped closer, his expression unrelenting. "Officer Harding, you've crossed a line today. You've abused your authority, you've endangered an innocent woman and her unborn child, and you've brought disgrace to the badge you wear. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Harding opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around, searching for support among his fellow officers, but found none. The weight of his actions was suffocating, and the judgment in David's eyes left no room for excuses. "Take his badge and weapon," David ordered, his voice like steel. "Place him under arrest." The crowd murmured in approval as Harding colleagues moved to carry out the order. His face turned pale as the badge he once wore with pride was unpinned and the holster at his side was removed. For the first time, he felt the crushing realization of what he had done and the consequences he now faced. As Harding was led away in handcuffs, David turned his attention to the gathered crowd. He addressed them with the same commanding authority that had earned him the respect of the community over the years. "I want to thank you all for standing up and bearing witness to what happened here today," he began. "Your voices, your actions, and your recordings will ensure that justice is served. This is not just about my daughter. This is about holding those in power accountable, and I promise you, this department will not sweep this under the rug." The crowd erupted in applause, their earlier anger giving way to hope. David's words carried the weight of his position, but also the conviction of a father determined to protect his own. As the onlookers began to disperse, he turned to the remaining officers on the scene. "We'll need a full report on this incident," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I want every detail, every statement, and every recording. This will not go unanswered." The officers nodded, their expressions a mix of respect and unease. David's reputation as a fair but firm leader left no doubt that the investigation would be thorough. He returned to his SUV, his face a mask of grim determination as he headed to the hospital to be with Alana. At the hospital, Alana lay in a private room, her hand still resting on her belly as the rhythmic beeping of the monitors provided a semblance of calm. The pain had subsided, but the emotional toll lingered. Her father entered quietly, his towering presence immediately making her feel safer. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, pulling a chair to her bedside. Alana's eyes filled with fresh tears. I'm okay," she said, her voice trembling. "The baby's okay too, but," she trailed off, unable to put the experience into words. David reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but comforting. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve this. None of it. But I promise you, Harding will face the consequences." And I'll make sure this never happens again. Alana nodded, her father's words providing a glimmer of solace. Thank you, she whispered. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day hanging between them. Finally, Alana spoke. Dad, this isn't just about me. This happens to so many people, and most of them don't have someone like you to protect them. David's jaw tightened. I know, he said quietly, and that's why I'll keep fighting. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been treated like this. Change doesn't come easy, but it will come. Alana squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his resolve. I'm proud of you, she said softly. David leaned forward and kissed her forehead. And I'm proud of you, he replied. You're stronger than you know. In the days that followed, the incident became a flashpoint for change. The footage captured by bystanders spread rapidly online, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. Chief David held a press conference, addressing the incident with transparency and a commitment to justice. Harding faced multiple charges, including assault and abuse of power, and his case became a symbol of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed within law enforcement. Alana's story resonated with countless others who had faced similar injustices. She received messages of support from all over the country, and her bravery in the face of adversity inspired many to speak out. With her father's guidance, she began to channel her pain into advocacy, determined to make a difference for her child and for future generations. While the scars of that day would never fully fade, Alana found strength in her resilience and the unwavering love of her family. Together, she and her father vowed to continue the fight for justice, knowing that their voices could create ripples of change in a world that desperately needed it. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the city streets. Alana sat on the porch of her father's home, a warm blanket draped over her shoulders and a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The quiet hum of life moving on around her felt surreal after the chaos of the past few days. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel the stillness. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, where her baby stirred gently. That small movement, that flicker of life, grounded her. It reminded her why she had fought so hard, why she had endured the fear and humiliation. It wasn't just about her. It was about the future she wanted for her child, a future where they wouldn't have to carry the same burdens she had borne. Her father, Chief David, joined her on the porch, his towering frame softened by the fading light. He carried a file in his hand, but his expression was one of calm and reflection. Sitting beside her, he placed the file on the small table between them. You've been quiet today, he said gently. Alana nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Just thinking, she replied. About what? She took a sip of her tea before answering. About how this isn't over. About how many people go through what I did and don't get justice. She looked at him, her gaze steady. I keep wondering if it would have turned out differently if you weren't my dad. David's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. You're right. It might have. And that's what we need to change. It's not fair, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. I was lucky, but so many others aren't. I can't stop thinking about them. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Alana, what happened to you is a stark reminder of how much work we still have to do. But the way you handled yourself, the strength you showed, that's what's going to make a difference. She shook her head. I don't feel strong, Dad. I was terrified. Being strong doesn't mean you're not afraid, he said, his voice firm but kind. It means you kept going, even when you were scared. You're stronger than you know. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, David reached for the file and opened it, revealing several documents. What's that? Alana asked, glancing at the papers. This is everything we've compiled on Harding, he said. Complaints, reports, witness statements. It's a damning record, Alana, and it's going to make sure he never holds a badge again. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. That's good, she said softly. David placed a hand on her shoulder. But it's just the beginning. This department needs change, and it needs it now. I'm going to push for reforms, for better training, for accountability at every level. and I want you to be part of that change." Alana blinked, surprised. "Me? You've lived it," he said. "Your voice, your story, can make an impact. You can help people see what needs to be fixed and why. If you're ready, I think you could make a real difference." She considered his words, the enormity of what he was asking. It was daunting, but it also felt right. "Okay," she said finally, a spark of determination lighting in her eyes. "I'll do it. For the baby. For everyone who doesn't have someone like you fighting for them." David smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's my girl." The following weeks were a whirlwind. The footage of Alana's encounter had gone viral, igniting conversations across the country. Protests called for justice not only for her, but for the countless others who had suffered similar injustices. Alana found herself at the center of a movement, her voice amplified by the pain and anger of so many others. With her father's guidance, she began to speak out, sharing her story in interviews and at community meetings. She met with activists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens who were all united in their desire for change. It wasn't easy. Reliving the trauma took a toll on her, but she found strength in the knowledge that her voice could inspire others. Harding's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against him, combined with the public's outcry, left no room for leniency. He was convicted of assault and abuse of power, and his sentencing sent a clear message. This behavior would no longer be tolerated. For Alana, the journey was far from over. She knew that systemic change wouldn't come overnight, but she was determined to keep fighting. Her experiences had lit a fire in her, one that burned not just for herself, but for her child and for all those who came before her. As she stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of supporters, she felt a swell of hope. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. With her father by her side and the support of her community, she knew they could create a world where her child could grow up safe and free. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "But together, we'll make sure no one else has to go through what I did. We'll build a future we can all be proud of." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a chorus of solidarity and determination. Alana smiled, her hand resting on her belly. This was the beginning of something new, something powerful, and she was ready to face it head-on.